Hi, folks. Well, listen, there's this rumor that Jefferson sent a moose into cyberspace. And what I heard is that this is all that's left. So we have been very fortunate to have Professor David Post travel in from Philadelphia today to discuss the incident of the moose in cyberspace. And he is currently the Herman Stern Professor of Law at the Beasley School of Law at Temple. He's written a book, In Search of Jefferson's Moose, Notes on the State of Cyberspace, and of course is also extensively published in addition to that work. And we are privileged to have Professor Post speak with us today. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be here. So I wrote this book. I really did write this book. In Search of Jefferson's Moose, Notes on the State of Cyberspace, as Rose said. It's a book about the internet through Jefferson's eyes. What I tried to do is to rewrite Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which is the only book that he published in his lifetime, an extraordinary, though rather obscure, 1781 compendium about the New World and everything in it. It's a hard book to summarize, my book, his book too, but mine is a hard book to summarize in sort of 20 or 30 minutes, and that's not what I'm really planning to do here. It's hard to summarize because it's not really an argument. If it were an argument, I could walk you through the main points and explain a little bit about what the conclusion I draw, but it's really not. It's more of a perspective, a metaphor, a way to look at things, at the internet in particular, but not only the internet. It gets built up piece by piece over the course of the book, and it either adds up to something coherent at the end or it doesn't, and I leave that to the reader to judge. But in any event, I can't really take you through it in 20 minutes or so. We'd be moving too fast. We'd all get dizzy and a little seasick. I can, though, tell you a little bit about why I wrote it and what I learned from it. I wrote the book for a number of reasons, but a big one was this. I've been working on internet law, legal issues on the internet for about 15 years or so. It's not exactly the lifespan of the net, but it's pretty close to the entire period when the internet has really been a force in the national and international consciousness. And I've been trying during that period to get people to do something that seemed, and still seems, pretty straightforward and sensible, but which I found strikes many people as radical and outrageous and even absurd. And it is this. It's to ask the question, if this internet were a new place, planet internet, or a newly discovered island in the Pacific, what kind of law would we want there? Now, it's just a metaphor. It's just a thought experiment. I know the internet is not a planet. I know it's not an island in the Pacific. Not an idiot. But it's a starting point, I think, for a discussion of internet law. What kind of copyright law would make sense for the internet if we were writing such a thing? If we could start fresh, writing on a blank slate for this place. Surely a comparison of that law, whatever we come up with the one we actually have, will be helpful in understanding what the law that we have should look like and what we want it to do. So like I said, it seems to me pretty straightforward and very useful, because when you look at things that way, if you try to answer that question, what kind of copyright law would make sense for the internet if we were writing such a thing? It's so obvious. It's even self-evident, I think, in the Jeffersonian sense, that you would not come up with anything remotely resembling, with respect to its fundamentals, the copyright law that we have. How so, you ask? I hope. Or else you'll be very bored by the rest of this talk. Well, here are some things that we would surely not have, we would not choose to have in this copyright law, this new copyright law. Since we began lunch an hour or so ago, 1.7 million copyright protected works, each with an owner or owners, came into being. Or maybe 22.6 million or 1.8 billion. We don't know. We don't know how many. In fact, nobody can know how many, but we do know it's a very, very large number. That's how our copyright law works. Copyright lawyers in the room, of course, already know this. Copyright protection begins at the moment a work is created without the necessity of the author doing anything. The moment an original work of authorship is fixed in a tangible form from which it can be perceived, reproduced, or communicated for more than a transitory duration, moment it is placed in a blog posting, included in an email, saved in a Photoshop file, a Word document, a video file, an MP3 file, etc., etc. Copyright is already attached to it. As the statute itself puts it, copyright protection subsists in it from the moment of creation. No registration required, no notice required, no deposit required, no nothing required. Now, that's a very odd rule. That's a very odd rule to have in a place where original works of authorship are being created in such unimaginable numbers. You couldn't keep track of copyright ownership on the internet if you wanted to. There's no processor big enough or powerful enough just to keep track of who owns what. Not at this scale and not with these numbers. Surely it would strike us as odd there on planet Internet to begin with a rule that at the very outset is impossible to manage. It doesn't seem like it's going to be helpful in bringing order to this place and allowing people to manage their affairs in a sensible way. And of course, it gets worse, a lot worse. Every time one of these 22.6 million or 1.8 billion or however many there are copyrighted works created in the last hour, every time they are reproduced, that is presumptively an infringing act, possibly excused by an exception or a defense, but infringing unless excused. Now, Planet Internet is a place where the reproduction of information is fundamental to its very existence, part of its nature, part of the way things are on this Internet. You don't have an Internet, at least not this Internet, without the reproduction of information on a massive scale. The Internet doesn't really do anything besides reproducing information. That's how it does its job. That is its job, getting information from one corner of the globe to another. Each step presumptively infringing, a violation of the copyright holder's rights, unless you can point to an exception or a defense. So now we're talking really big numbers. Billions upon billions of copyrighted works getting reproduced billions and billions of times, each work protected, each reproduction presumptively infringing. Every hour, every day. It is self-evident. Am I missing something here? That this is not the rule we would choose if we were starting fresh, if we were writing copyright law for the net, to make every act of reproduction presumptively a violation of someone's already existing rights. Why in heaven's name would we start there? It's a system that will not just be difficult, but impossible to keep track of. Why would we start there? These rules do not scale. However well-suited they may have been to the world of atoms, they're grotesquely ill-suited for the networked ecosystem of bits because they don't scale. The amount of processing you would need to manage this system is astronomical. You would need decades and decades to process the copyright implications of 1 hour's worth of activity on the Internet. Why would we, if we were starting fresh, set the system up that way, protecting everything, making pretty much everything that happens an infringement? Why would we set up the system so you can't do anything without implicating and invoking someone's copyright? Lots of other examples. I could go on. Even a casual glance around our new place, Planet Internet, reveals some extraordinary new forms of collaborative authorship and collaborative production of creative works. Open source software, Wikipedia, Web 2.0, user-generated content, remix, whatever you want to call it. Extraordinary is surely the right adjective. Not only didn't we have a Wikipedia in 1985, we couldn't imagine a Wikipedia in 1985. And we would surely not have a rule with respect to these interesting new forms of collaborative creative output that their copyright status depends on assessing the intent of each contributor, which is the rule we have, of course. And surely we wouldn't declare that to figure out whether or not one of these trillions of events constitutes copyright infringement, we'd have to apply a four-factor, case-by-case balancing test, which is, of course, our fair use doctrine. Again, you couldn't evaluate the joint authorship or fair use implications of 10 minutes of Internet activity if you had until the end of the century. And finally, if we're thinking about the copyright law we want to have in this new place, we'd surely look for a copyright law that does the things copyright law is supposed to do, to incentivize people to do creative things they would not otherwise do, while permitting the widest possible dissemination and reuse of works that have already been created. And we look around Planet Internet, a place where admittedly copyright law has been flaunted and often ignored, but where certain kinds of activity at least have nonetheless flourished. We'd look around and we would take that into consideration. We don't need copyright, and we shouldn't have copyright for works that will be created anyway without copyright protection. Copyright is not a natural right belonging to authors that must be protected at all costs, regardless of consequence. It's a social right we grant because and to the extent that we think it makes us all better off. That, by the way, is a Jeffersonian insight, Jefferson being the first person, I believe, to articulate that view of copyright and intellectual property. Intellectual property rights are not natural rights because they don't derive from the nature of things. It is in the nature of things, Jefferson wrote, that ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe. Ideas are like the air we breathe, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation. They're like fire, expansible over space without lessening their density at any point. The moment they're divulged, they're in the possession of everyone, and the receiver cannot dispossess himself of them. But no one possesses them the less because others possess the whole. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction without lessening mine, just as he who lights his candle at mine receives light without darkening me. I mean, how can you not love a guy who can write like that? Seriously. You don't get rights to protect your intellectual property from the nature of things. You get them from society. They derive from social law. The Copyright Act, for example. This view does not mean we shouldn't have intellectual property rights. It only means we get to decide, and we have to decide, whether or not to have them and how much of them to have. So we would look around this new place and ask ourselves what works require the incentive that copyright law provides and which ones do not. And it is obvious that there are many kinds of works that fall into the latter category, the works for which we do not need the incentive of copyright. Were that not true, the Internet would be what Jack Valenti thought it was going to be, a barren wasteland devoid of interesting content. But it's not. Notwithstanding the lack or absence of effective copyright protection, it's certainly hard to say that it lacks creative activity. Again, does not mean we should get rid of all of our copyright law on Planet Internet, but it does mean we want to think a little more carefully than we have in the past about what kinds of things need and what kinds of things don't need copyright protection. Now, reasonable people will surely disagree about that, not to mention the unreasonable people, about exactly what kind of copyright law will be best in this thought experiment. But that's the conversation we should be having. What kind of law makes sense in this environment? And if it's not the law we now have, how do we transition from here to there? But that's not the conversation that we're having much in copyright circles, I find. Most of our time is consumed arguing about how to make our current law, our legacy law, work more effectively and enforceably on the internet. We're spending our time arguing about whether reproducing 100 milliseconds of a streamed television broadcast in a transient storage buffer for 1.2 seconds constitutes an infringement of copyright. We're arguing about the circumstances in which a search engine provider can be deemed to have knowledge or awareness that material to which links are provided is infringing. We're having a conversation about whether distribution of cell phone ringtones constitutes a public performance of the underlying musical work. We're not talking enough, in my view, about how we get from the law we have to one that actually makes sense. So, my metaphor isn't working if we're not having that conversation. I'm not getting through. Or we'd be having a very different conversation. So that's when it hit me. Although actually not till I finished my own book. It hit me that I need a moose. So let me tell you a little bit about the moose and why I need it. You may know the story of Jefferson's moose. In 1787, while he was serving as the ambassador to France, Jefferson had the complete skeleton and carcass with antlers of an American moose 7 feet tall at the shoulders, shipped to him in Paris, where it was then reassembled and installed in the entry hall of his residence. It's an amusing little episode, Jefferson at his most lovably eccentric. I came upon it early in the course of the research for this book, years ago, and I used to use it in talks and papers for that purpose, really, to illustrate the lovable eccentricity, the Jefferson nobody knows. I didn't take it too seriously, to be honest. In my defense, let me say that when you work on Jefferson, you come across a lot of odd bits like that. He was truly an eccentric character. A few of the many examples. Every year, for 8 years, he kept a detailed record of the first and last appearance of 37 different fruits and vegetables in the food markets in Washington, D.C., all while he was serving as President of the United States. He kept grizzly bears on the White House lawn. He smuggled rice out of Italy to send back to the United States for cultivation at a time when to do so was a capital offense, punishable by death. He compiled grammars and vocabularies for 50 Native American languages. He wrote a 9-page letter about wind at a time when he had broken his wrist and the act of writing gave him excruciating pain. So there's plenty of those. So you come across a lot of that. I thought the moose was in that category. But I think my book got interesting when I started taking the moose seriously. When I actually set off in search of Jefferson's moose, or at least, if not the moose, at least the meaning of the moose. What was he up to? Getting a moose to Paris in 1787 was no small task. It would be no small task to get the moose to Paris in 2009, when you think about it. What did he care about? Why did he care so much about it? To go to the expense, which was considerable, and the trouble, which was immense, to do this. And in 1787, when he had, to put it mildly, lots of other things on his mind, he is in the middle of, he's probably the only person on the planet who is centrally connected to the two great events of 1787, the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and the complete breakdown of French society and what would ultimately lead to the French Revolution. Jefferson was in the middle of those. And in the midst of all this, here comes the moose. He called it, in a letter to a friend, an acquisition more precious than you can imagine. Was he serious? It turns out he was serious. Lucky for me, I guess, or the book wouldn't have been as interesting as it is. He was indeed up to something with this, a lot of things, and all of them important and all of them profound. He shipped the moose to Paris because it was big, and he shipped the moose to Paris because it was new. I'm going to focus on the new today, but let me say a few words about the big. have a lot more to say about that in the book, if you are interested. The Moose was about scale, was about Jefferson's search for the laws governing the growth and size of things, how small things get big and how big things get small, and what happens as a consequence. Biologists think a lot about scale. Architects think a lot about scale. Map makers think a lot about scale. And it's no coincidence that Jefferson was a great biologist, architect, and map maker. He shipped the Moose to Paris because he was having an argument about scale, a debate about the relative size of New World and Old World animals. There was a theory advanced by a number of very prominent European scientists that animals in the New World got smaller. They were smaller versions of their Old World counterparts. And Jefferson thought this was baloney, and he spent an unbelievable amount of time over a 15-year period refuting it. The moose, largest of the New World quadrupeds, far larger than its European relatives, was, he hoped, sort of the coup de grace, as it were, in this debate. You know, degenerate animals in the New World, you know, come to my apartment is a sort of the final nail in the coffin. And he was up to something very important with this. Jefferson's study of size and scale helped him solve one of the great scaling problems in history, the so-called problem of the extended republic. How do you get republican government? How do you get government by the people, government in which the governed control the governors? How do you get that to scale? How could it work over an entire continent? Many people, many very smart people, including Alexander Hamilton, who was no dummy, believed that it could not be done. It was called Montesquieu's law, in fact, that it could not be done. You could not scale Republican government beyond small communities. And Jefferson thought that was baloney, too, and he solved that problem. And if this were a talk about the big, I'd tell you more about that, especially because principles of size and scale are so important when talking about this place, about the internet. But it's not a talk about the big, so you'll just have to read that for yourself, about how he solved it, and it makes a great story. But like I said, he brought the moose to Paris not just because it was big, but because it was new, killing two birds, as it were, with one moose. He wanted to dazzle. He wanted to dazzle. He wanted to show people in the old world that the new world had things in it they had never seen before, maybe never imagined before. It was part of a lifelong project to create the new world, to create the belief in the new world, that it was not merely a projection of the old world. A lifelong project to start fresh, to wipe the slate clean of old ideas and old ways of doing things so that we could begin the hard work of designing a system of laws more appropriate for the new place. So where's my moose? What's my moose? What do I assemble in the entrance hall of my residence to get people to think about starting fresh, wiping the slate clean of old ideas and old ways so that we can begin the hard work of designing a system of laws more appropriate for the new place? You know, I tried this. That doesn't work so well. So, as I said, I didn't have an answer to this, really, by the time I finished my own book. In fact, by the time I finished my own book, I didn't even realize, it wasn't until then that I realized how badly I needed a moose. So in a sense, we're picking up that conversation at the end of the book. I gave this version of this talk back in March at Stanford Law School. And Larry Lessig, who I'm sure most of you know, professor of law at Stanford, was there in the front row and watching. And the next day, this shows up on his blog. This video, he writes, is Jefferson's moose. If you come to the net armed with the idea that the old system of copyright is going to work just fine here, this, more than anything, is going to get you to recognize you need some new ideas. And of course it won't work, because that's sort of the law. Well, what can I do? YouTube video.
Play that 16th note groove just straight. Going. You'll be amazed.
Okay. Do
it again. All right.
We need more than one guitar part. There'll
Okay.
be somebody playing single notes, somebody playing chords, and they'll mix them together.
Okay. And let's just pick the mother of all funk chords. Let's pick a ninth chord.
You get the idea. No, I don't. You don't? Okay. Well, that's why we have a question and answer session at the end. I think it's awfully good. You roll that out and you say, we need some new thinking about copyright law. 3 words, I think, in this crowd will do the trick. They are clear those rights. Clearing the rights to this video with its snippets from dozens of separate audiovisual works, sound recordings, and musical works would take, wow, what are we talking, 200 hours? 250 hours? If it could be done at all. Suppose the authors of this video wanted to comply with copyright law, and they came to you for help. Could you even do it at all? It would take more time to clear the copyright on this video than it took to create the video. And there are hundreds of millions of works like that. That's a system that is profoundly out of kilter. Again, it seemed obvious to me. Copyright is supposed to empower creators. That's why we have it. And it's not doing its job anymore. So the book is the start, I hope, of that conversation. And I guess if none of this makes you want to read the book, I'll finish with this, and then we can get to your questions. You should know that the omens and the zeitgeist are with me on this book. As those of you in the audience who know me know, I did most of this work. I spent about 12 years writing this book, most of the time in Vermont, where I spend my summers. The day I sent off the final version of this manuscript, and I swear on my mother's grave that this is true, I sent off the final, after 12 years of work, the last time I'm going to see this manuscript before it is in print. I have to drive to the post office, local post office. I drop it off, and I drive back home, and there is a male moose standing in the meadow in front of my house. And he stayed there for 2 days. If my wife were here, she would confirm this. It was with the full rack, as they say. So I know there are no omens anymore, and this is an ancient Rome or something. But read the book is the end. So, questions or comments? Yes.
In 12 years ago or 14 years ago when the web really first started started, let's say 94-ish in that time frame, everything was really client-server. You had a server, and I have a computer, maybe I have an application on the computer, and everything was a one-to-many, but down to my desktop. Now that we're moving into really this networked world with peer-to-peer, with cloud computing, with services rather than ownership, one, I'm curious how you see that, what I think is a radical transformation of the networked world impacting the kind of changes that you're talking about. And the corollary to this question is really whenever I'm at any of these programs where the conversation is about trying to adapt and change copyright law, inevitably it comes down to, well, these little incremental changes, and never has anybody actually embraced this notion that everything could be thrown out and start all over.
There you go. There you go. That's why I came. Exactly. I think everything has to be thrown out. I mean, you know, I really mean it when I say this is the start of the conversation. I mean, I want this to be the start of the conversation. I don't have it all worked out perfectly. I can't lay the copyright law that I think works in front of you because I think it's a complicated issue and it will take the efforts of many good people asking the question. I think the absence, I think we took maybe a small, one small but fundamental change, I think, that I think is absolutely required in this environment, which is that we have to go back to the formalities for copyright protection. We got rid of formalities when the U.S. joined the Berne Convention in 1989 at exactly the wrong moment. As I couldn't have been more perfect, that we were now entering an era in which we need copyright notice, we need registration, because otherwise we cannot find we cannot keep track of the copyright implications of any work. So one thing I think that's, if I'm starting fresh in copyright, without the legacy holdover of the Berne Treaty, I think we go back to the system that we had some time ago so that people can know, or at least have some chance of knowing, what the copyright implications of their activities might be. And that you could rest reasonably well assured if there was no copyright notice or something is not in the Copyright Office database, that it is out there for you to take and to reuse. I think that would be, Larry Lessig, again, had this suggestion several years ago, and it's a small change but would have an enormous impact. Make people renew their copyright, which we could probably do even under Berne. Make copyright should last for 2 years, 5 years, some short period, and require, if you want continued protection, that you at least have to send a notice and 50 cents into the Copyright Office. 99.9% of the things out on the internet will then drop out of copyright, which is where they belong. And only those who are really interested in protecting their works will have any protection. That's the right default to use in this environment, not the one that we have, which is that everything is protected unless you go to ungodly efforts to unprotect it. So that's one answer. But I don't. I mean, it's a fair question. If I had, I could pass out the statute here, the Internet Copyright Act. I don't have that. But I don't think I'm nobody speaks through. I'm not the oracle. I think if people are, we have a lot of smart people in this room and elsewhere thinking about copyright, if we're asking that question, we will come up with a better law than we have. Yeah. Yes.
Without having read the book, I'm hesitant to say this, but from what I heard you say, the underpinning of this seems to be based on the idea that copyright in the United States and more broadly in the Anglophone world derives from the social utility of it, which is a very different philosophy, as you alluded to,
yes,
from the natural rights philosophy.
Correct.
However, outside of the Anglophone world, nobody accepts that. And is it possible or practical to, even if we said, okay, we're going to go back to the world before the U.S. joined Berne, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily go along with that, and it's a completely alien underlying philosophy.
I didn't hear
really a question in there.
I know. That's why I always say that when my students go off and they're talking and talking, I say, okay, well, what's the question? Where's the question mark? Can you discuss that? That's cheating. No, it's a very good point. You're absolutely right. I'm glad you caught that in a way, and I do talk a little bit about that in the book. We have the world consists of two very fundamentally different views about what copyright is. the natural rights, moral rights approach in many of the continental countries and elsewhere, and this sort of social law approach. This is symptomatic of a problem that we face all the time on the net, and nobody has a good solution to this. Just of crying in the wilderness here of how do we live in a place, in a world, in which people have very different, contrary views about how to order their activities. Whether that, and again, I don't think it's insoluble. I really don't. But at the moment, we don't have the institutions that can address that problem. We don't have a place where people can really talk about how to resolve those. We don't have any way to talk about segregating documents on some sort of basis via labeling or some technological envelope to indicate which of the two regimes it has been produced under, a possibility. But you've raised a very good point. And, again, I in a sense, I throw up my hands and say that's a hard, profoundly hard problem. We do not want to give up. I think we have the Jeffersonian view of intellectual property is very deep-seated in this country, and it is what it is. And it is contrary to one of the things that I found very interesting in talking about copyright issues on the net for the last, 10 or 15 years, is how much of it actually reflects this distinction between natural rights and social rights, even in this country. I mean, there are a lot of people, when you have a conversation about file sharing or peer-to-peer, all that, who will, you come to a point where a number of people in the audience will say, in effect, it's just not fair to the authors. It's not fair to take, it's stealing, to take somebody's work and spread it around without their consent. That, I think, is a notion that rests, in a sense, on the idea that authors have some inherent rights to their work, which, at least to a Jeffersonian, we say, no, they don't. Yeah.
Is your book available for free download on the...
That's a good question. That's a good question. My publisher would not allow that. Oxford University Press. Talk to Oxford. I always get this, sorry?
You can self-publish, SSRN.
Not without, they will kill me, actually, if I do that. No, but I thought about this on the way over here. I knew I often get this question. It's a fair question. But it's a little bit like asking, when we have a discussion about, if we're discussing the death penalty, and I have a position, I oppose the death penalty, and then someone asks, well, what about, if your daughter was, tortured and murdered in front of your eyes, would you oppose the death penalty then? And of course I'd say, no, I wouldn't. I would strangle that. I'm pretty comfortable with that, actually. That's one answer. It's a little bit, my views about my book should not necessarily control the discussion about what the public needs here. And I can say, if I were to take this position, I'm going to modify this in a second, but if I were to take the position, no, don't download my book, but I can, consistent with that, say I think that copyright laws should be, if not done away with, at least modified substantially. I want, like anybody else, I want, more money is better than less money. But that should not be, that's not the end of the discussion. The second thing I want to say about that is a little more complicated, but the wrong here. I think this helps me think about copyright issues on the net. Again, it's using this metaphor of the separate place. It's not a separate place, but the wrong that people are concerned about, and I think genuinely concerned about and fairly concerned about, is the smuggling of works from one place to another. Is the fact that authors of songs or books or plays or whatever have written works, have been promised a certain kind of protection for those works in real space, and then someone takes it without their permission and puts it up on the net for everybody to distribute. What I would like to see is more thought being given to how do we punish or stop that from happening without making it unlawful. Once something's on the net, I want it to be circulated. It has to be circulatable, or the net is going to choke on itself. So let's think about, again, I don't have a solution to this, but I'd like to see more thought given to how do we, what are the ways in which we could focus on the real wrong here? And the wrong is the wrong of smuggling, of taking a work from one place and bringing it without the author's permission into another place where it can be reproduced and distributed to your heart's content. And the final thing I will say about that is, of course, that's a very familiar problem in copyright law. We've always had that problem, in a sense. We did it ourselves. You could smuggle works from Britain into the United States up until 1891 and reproduce them to your heart's content. I mean, the Chinese are going through that as well. That's a very common problem, and eventually they sort of get folded into the international system. And again, that's the conversation I think I want to have, but not in a way that makes every act of reproduction on the net an infringement of someone's copyright. All the way in the back.
What changes do you want to make to the way we think about fair use?
You know, we all love fair use, and sorry, we didn't all stand up and sort of salute. What I want to do with fair use is to make it more predictable. It just can't work. I know all the arguments for why it's not predictable, and they're good arguments. It's because it's a subtle, it depends upon the facts of the case, and it's a subtle question, and courts have to do this balancing to see what. But I think in this environment that can't work, or it does not work well because you can never give an answer to whether something is or is not fair use. Jessica Littman many years ago suggested, why don't we do what most people think fair use is anyway, which is commercial versus non-commercial. I'm not enamored of that line particularly, but it is at least a line, and will resolve most cases on one side or the other. And I think we need something like that. I really do. I need to be able to tell people, I get it all the time. I'm sure you do too, those of you who are copyright lawyers here in the room. Can I do this? Can I do this? And we can never answer. And this stuff it's just happening on too large a scale for us to say, well, if you give me 10 hours, I'll give you a memo that will not resolve the question, actually, either. You can't do that 100 million times an hour. And I think so we need something that says yes or no, or that is at least clearer like that.
Okay.
Okay.
You talk about authors and you talk about thieves. But what you don't talk about are the obstinate, greedy forces in our country, the record companies, the music publishers, the performing rights societies, and their lobbies that prevent any meaningful change, such as compulsory licensing, from happening. Don't you have to at least mention that, as opposed to an author who has relatively little to say about what happens with his
works? When I made I did a little blog posting of my own about this talk. I invited people to come to the talk. I said it should be very interesting, and I said, I'd be pretty disappointed. Come to the Copyright Society, a talk jointly sponsored by the Copyright Society and the Internet Society. I sort of would be a little disappointed if fisticuffs don't break out in this crowd. So I'm glad to see somebody taking the bull by the horn, the moose by the horns, as it were. Don't I have to talk about it? The political economy of copyright is complicated and ugly. That's correct. It is complicated and it is ugly. And I think we are being held hostage. We're being held hostage by relatively narrow and parochial interests who are determined to retrofit the entire internet to solve what is their problem, and a relatively small problem. 10 years ago when I was giving this talk, I looked this up, and I found out that the entire record industry, is a big industry, important industry, and worthy of protection and respect, was a sort of $35 billion a year operation. And Cisco Systems, just building routers for the net, was $60 billion. So so we're sort of the tail is wagging this dog if we let copyright overwhelm the internet. So I'm concerned about it, and I think I share much of your anger about it. On the other hand, there are other people making that argument. you know what I mean? I mean, this is a different way into the same problem. And I want to see if I can, I don't have to think the record company people are bad guys. I don't even know if I do think the record company people are bad guys, to be honest. I think they are looking out for their interests as they should. And we have to look out for our interests as we should. And where they conflict, the public benefit is more important. And I think we can have that discussion without, I go to plenty of talks and conferences where we have the discussion you are talking about, and how do we get the record companies and what's wrong with them and why don't they realize it and all that. And that's a different discussion really than the one I think we can get to it. We can perhaps even more effectively get to a rational copyright law if we sort of push that a little bit to the side. That has been overheated, I think, a bit over the past 5 or 10 years. And I don't need that to just look around and say, it's not because they're bad. I don't want to change copyright law because the record companies are bad guys. I want to change copyright law because it's idiotic on the internet. It makes no sense at all, and it's just ill-suited. Let's have that conversation, and to which they can contribute. It's a big tent, as it were. Yes?
How do you reconcile that with the fact that Apple, who has created iTunes, has become the most successful business, and they're actually the one company that's licensing music, with other large billion-dollar companies that claim that they have fair use of other people's works, when they could easily go out and do the same thing Apple did? I'm
not quite following the question.
I'm just saying that there's got to be some responsibility on internet companies' parts. Apple, with iTunes, has been the most successful business model on the internet to sell music.
Correct.
But also licenses and has done so since the beginning.
Right.
Versus other companies who have not, and yet are screaming that we have to change all copyright law and put all onus on the copyright owners.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I actually do think that it helps to look at this as a, again, I don't want to use the word smuggling is a pejorative, but if you're taking if somebody releases a song on CD and you want to distribute it on the internet, I think you should get permission from that person, unless they do it themselves. Quite honestly, I mean, what I want is a world in which if you are taking advantage, if I put my book up on the net, I don't want a bunch of rules that keep people from doing things with it. If I put my book up on the net, if I'm taking advantage of the extraordinary distribution capacity of this medium, then I have to take the bitter with the better, as it were. Apple is doing something different in iTunes, and they are paying artists for the right to do that, and I think that's perfectly appropriate, quite frankly. I really do. Yeah.
I'm going to go back to something you said, because I actually disagree for a second with the notion that, well, the Jessica Littman notion that fair use should be what people think it is, and that distinction is commercial versus non-commercial. I think that consumers think that, first of all, if they buy something, whether it's a digital download on iTunes or a CD, that ownership gives them rights to do things that, in fact, they don't really have the rights to do, or at least the copyright community would say, no, you can't share it, you can't store it in a locker, you can't transfer it to this device, you don't actually own it. And I think when you talk about what people expect fair use to be, they expect fair use to be like everything else they own in an ownership model, that they can do with it what they want. They can lend it to a friend, they can take it back, you know. So is that what fair use?
Well, I mean, in a world of sort of pervasive creation and distribution of works, you know, if that's what people think, you know, that's where it's going to go. Or that's sort of how we want the law to work, is that it reflects what people think it should be. Now, I grant you that that's not, it's not entirely a satisfactory answer. I don't know if there. I think there has to be a way for. I think people do instinctively feel, at least for the net, that the power this gives them to share information with one another is what makes this an extraordinary medium, and they're going to use that. Unlike many of my colleagues, you know, over on this side of the copyright fence, as it were, I am not at all opposed, and never have been, to creators locking up their works as they wish with sort of whatever technological device. I mean, it's a pain in the neck. I don't like it when I'm downloading something that has some sort of DRM or whatever. But as far as the rights go, I think that's actually a better solution. One of my proposals for copyright law was, A, get rid of everything, B, keep Section 1201, the anti-circumvention provision, which says that if somebody has locked something up, it is a copyright infringement to unlock it, unauthorized access to those works. That's a more sensible regime. I don't like 1201 because it also is in the middle of the Copyright Act as we now have it, so it's a little bit of belt and suspenders, or like machete and hammer. But if that were the only provision of copyright law, I'd actually be much more in favor of it. I think that will, again, it's putting the onus on the creator to do something if they want protection in this environment, and then everything else that comes around, if it is unprotected, you are free to do with it what you wish. I think that's a better copyright regime, personally. Yeah, in the back.
I studied under Professor Stern here and in Israel, and he was very much in labor law and arbitration about realism and reality. And I took some photographs that were used all over the world, stolen all over the world. And I had a sue all over the world. And the only thing that protected me was copyright. Everywhere, whether it was internet or whether it was National Geographic, was copyright. And everywhere I went, I was only successful in settlements because of copyright. And anybody who would try and come and vitiate copyright is going to take my rights away from me.
That's exactly what we're going to do. Look, I mean, where did your rights come from?
From taking the picture.
No, actually. No, I mean, there we go. I mean, who asked about the different philosophies? I mean, if you think your rights to this work came just from creating it, and that now you have rights in it, that's a view. It's not our view. That is our view, meaning it's not the view that is embedded in the United States intellectual property regime. You got the rights because we decided you needed the rights or you wouldn't create the work. That's why you have the rights. And again, I understand, and apparently if you are Israeli or you know Israeli copyright law, I believe has the other view, which is that it's an inherent part of your personality once you take the photograph, and that needs to be protected at all costs.
You want to go back?
We get to decide. And sorry?
You want to go back to the days when musicians weren't protected, when someone would write a song and everybody could take the song, and the poor guy starved to death. Woody Guthrie went through the country and died impoverished because of that.
We could have an argument about that. I mean, I disagree with that, honestly. We could just go out onto the net, and so it's what the net has taught us. Look, the net has taught us something in 10 years, which is that many people will create incredibly valuable and wonderful works without protection by copyright. I mean, that just seems, that is clear from looking, or because we don't have effective copyright protection, and yet there is an immense outpouring of creative activity. So we must not need it as much as we thought we needed it. Because if this were in 1990, and I'm telling you, and you've never heard of the internet, and I'm telling you, spinning out this story about this great new network and the global network, and it's coming, it's going to be wonderful, and people will be able to share and freely distribute, and it's going to be, you would have said, nothing's going to be there. There won't be, who's going to do any creative work without the incentive that copyright provides? And unless we can learn from history, right, we know that that was wrong. People will create. There is actually an urge to create. Who knew? Not for, do I want the musicians to starve? I'm a musician myself. I don't want the musicians to starve. But I want them to figure out, and this medium offers unbelievable advantages to millions of musicians who 10 years ago had no way to get their work to the public at all. So I don't want musicians to starve. I think there are more practicing musicians now doing creative. Somebody said, we're going to go back to the days, we're not going to have, with George Gershwin and Irving Berlin. I mean, I don't know about that. I don't know that I don't know that we don't have more creative musical activity taking place today because of the internet, remember my moose, than we did before. I think that is an open question, and I think actually the evidence is on my side on that. Yeah.
I never saw it.
Good. Louder, please. Well, I'll repeat the question.
You showed the video that you showed.
Yes.
And what if those images had been counterposed with something offensive? Graphic violence,
Okay.
pornography, something that the original creator would not have wanted their original idea associated with. Commerce aside, what about the rights of the original creator to control their product, their image, their little piece of themselves?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, like I said, I mean, in a discussion in a room this size, you have a number of people who think, who believe, and I don't want to sort of cast pejoratives or aspersions on the belief. It's not the belief that I have, but it is a belief that that is a projection of your personality. And that if somebody takes the song that you wrote and interposes it with graphic violence or something that is offensive, that they have done you a harm. I'm not sure I agree with that. And I'm not sure that American law is built upon a foundation that agrees with that, at least as far as the intellectual property is concerned. It's not a projection of your personality. That's not why we give you the copyright rights. We give you the copyrights because we want to incentivize you to produce. If you want to have a conversation with me about a tort of, I don't know, I mean, copyright law is not going to help you very much anyway in this circumstance. This is a sort of a trademark type issue, a reputation type issue. We have law that deals with that. Maybe it would apply in this circumstance, and that's sort of outside the scope of the discussion. Copyright law is a blunt instrument to deal with the problems that you are. In fact, a very ineffective instrument to deal with that problem if you think it is a problem.
You have a right on the back end to sue if they fail to get clearance. She sued for use of her photo without permission. If you use my clip in a way that's offensive to me, and it's copyrighted, I have a recourse.
Yeah, but you also, right, so for the 1 in a billion that has this problem, we're going to have a law that says all other 999,999,999 can also sue for copyright infringement. I mean, it's a perfect example of why copyright law is just the wrong vehicle to serve that interest. So you're going to choke down everybody who wants to reuse those videos in order to give a cause of action to the one person who may have a genuine complaint that their work has been used in a way that is offensive. That seems backwards to me. That seems bad. It's a wrong default. The default should be is you can make the video. If we want to talk, you want to talk about having a tort that for improper use of some kind or a sort of a tarnishment, maybe, yeah. I could see that, but let's clean up the default rule so that most of the stuff is not affected by that and that things can be circulating freely, and then layer that sort of rule on top of that. I'm not opposed. I'm told I have time for one more. So.
In light of the fact that the last overall copyright revision took almost a century, and at a time when the interests were of a much narrower spectrum,
yes,
much less diverse, the technology was much simpler. How many years is it going to take for you to throw out the present system, come up with a new one?
Oh, I mean,
that will be adopted by the Congress of the United States.
You know, a long time. It is a long time, but this is how you do it. You know, and I mean that genuinely. You're absolutely right. It's related to the question earlier. And the political economy of copyright is very complicated. It's not pretty, but I guess that's true of most industries. I mean, you know, if you want to, don't watch the sausages being made if you want to eat them later. So is this going to happen? Is this something I can snap my fingers and make happen? Of course not. But I honestly believe that it's, you know, here we've got a room full of New York copyright lawyers. If 10 of you buy into this in some way, that's a step forward. And we start having the conversation we need to have. And eventually, I think, you know, things do change. No? I mean, I've lived through, the Tax Act. The Internal Revenue Code actually was revised in 1986. I mean, it can happen. Miracles do happen. And this is something that people care enough about. And I do believe that. I think this now, we can make the copyright, in a sense, may have been harder to change because it was a small set of interests, all of them. And now it is an area of great public concern, and I think we could find a consensus position that the public actually shares, and eventually Congress comes along kicking and screaming. Maybe. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.